nominal.
The chamber pressure looks good.
Following up. Roger roll, Atlantic.
Water towers can fly! Yes!
Tango Delta nominal.
Fighting down speed off. Bring in, speed off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.
Show on YouTube delayed by FAA approval. Thank you for joining us so much today. We've got a few topics to talk about. Artemis 1 is fully stacked. Lucy has a solar array problem. Starliner has no valves. South Korea launched a new rocket, and Starship has chopsticks. I'm your host, Matt Anderson. And joining me, our NASASpaceflight News Director, Thomas Burghardt. Hello.
How you doing, man? How's it going, everybody?
It's going good. And NASASpaceflight reporter, Adrian Beil. Hi.
Hello. Thank you. How are we doing?
Good. And before we start, I want to go ahead and say that at any time during chat, if you have a question, you can use @NASASpaceflight to tag us, and we'll try to answer it during the course of the show. Gentlemen, let's talk rockets. SLS is looking good. I'll put together. Do we have a date?
Kind of. Well, we have a couple dates, and none of them have very high confidence levels. But you know, they're there. They exist. So yeah, our SLS fully stacked in the VAB. They got the stage adapter on earlier this month, and then Orion itself with its launch abort system got stacked up top. And for the first time ever, SLS rocket is now fully assembled. And we do have some launch date kind of updates. So NASA officially, once the stacking was complete, gave a little bit of a schedule update saying the wet dress rehearsal, the point of time where they're going to roll it out to Launchpad 39B, fully fuel the vehicle, do a whole simulated countdown prior to engine ignition. That wet dress rehearsal is now slated to be at the beginning of next year, so that's no earlier than January. And that is corresponding to the new, very much no earlier than launch date of February 12th. There's a launch period that goes from February 12th to February 27th, and they can launch within that window. And there's a couple of different those launch periods as you go later into the year. There's a bunch of those kind of 2-week-ish periods that they can launch within. And that has to do with how exactly they're doing their flyby of the moon. Or actually, it's an orbit of the moon. Excuse me, I should correct that. Orbit of the moon and come back, and how the trajectory works out. They have those periods where the trajectory works out. So February 12th is that no earlier than date. And when we say that, that means that is the earliest possible date that they are working to. That does not mean that that is necessarily the realistic launch target. There's also something called a risk-informed date, which is where they're rather expecting launch readiness to be there for both the vehicle side, the ground system side, the personnel, where everything is more realistically expected to line up, and that puts the launch probably somewhere in the April timeframe at the earliest. They'll have a lot more clarity on that schedule once the wet dress rehearsal is completed. There's a lot of tests that go on when they do the rollout for the first time and do the actual wet dress rehearsal. And once those tests have been checked off and they've implemented any correction action needed from those, there'll be a lot more certainty with the schedule estimates. So expect the launch date to move farther to the right from February, but that isn't the new no earlier than date.
Adrian, how do you feel seeing that thing fully stacked?
Great. Like in the past few months, it was cool to slowly seeing this rocket coming together with the SRBs attached, and then like the propulsion upper stage, the cryogenic propulsion upper stage going on top of it, and now with Orion, the capsule, the payload on the top. It's a full rocket. It's a full moon rocket standing there and waiting for its launch, and that's really, really cool to see. Say about SLS what you want, but I am very excited to see it fly next year.
It's been a while to have a fully stacked moon rocket, huh?
Fully stacked moon rocket. It's been a while since we've had a vehicle stacked in the vehicle assembly building. Last time that happened was a shuttle. So that's cool to see, to be honest. But it's also cool to think about, there's a lot of satellites launching on Artemis 1, and they're actually in that stage adapter that we saw getting mated in some of these B-roll clips. I believe there was originally supposed to be 13 CubeSats, and I believe all but 2 of them made the ride. 2 of the satellites had issues, then they'll launch on a later vehicle. So I believe 11 CubeSats will be hitching a ride to a lunar flyby. which is another cool thing. Good to see a lot of the science that'll come from those, as well as, of course, the main objective, which is that test flight of the Orion spacecraft, and really getting the Artemis program underway. There's a lot of other components to the program. There's things like the Capstone mission launching on Rocket Lab, which will help evaluate that orbit for the Lunar Gateway Station. There's of course Starship testing, and all that goes into getting the lander portion ready. And in this clip, you can actually see as they lower Orion onto the stage adapter, you can see the CubeSats sitting in the stage adapter there. But of course, the big ticket item for Artemis flight test is Artemis 1 and getting Orion and SLS off the ground. So it's just really cool to see it all fully stacked and one step closer.
I'm curious here. Is shuttle the last one? In which facility was Ares stacked and stored?
Ares 1 was also stacked in the vehicle assembly building, but that was prior to the final shuttle missions. So
Oh, there we go.
that was in 2009? Oh God, I'm gonna be called a fake Ares 1 fan. Hold on. Ares 1X.
Putting you in
Was
the
it? Yep,
spot here,
2009.
sorry.
See, I was
Not gonna
right.
gatekeep that.
October 20. In fact, 5 days from now will be the anniversary. So, you know, if you follow me on Twitter, heads up, there's Ares 1 content coming probably. But yeah, that was prior to the last shuttle missions. So.
Oh, well, I think these guys are going to be forgiving of you. We did have $10 from Moley Space Industries for the Thomas fan club.
What's up, Modi Space? Appreciate it.
We do have a couple questions here about SLS, and just as a reminder to the chat, if you have questions about other topics, try to hold them until we get to that section of the show. We are going to cover all the SpaceX stuff and some things about Lucy as well. So if you post them now, it's going to get lost in the shuffle. We had a €5 from Blazemonger who said, thoughts on the NASA RFI for commercial crew space transportation services. Alternatives for Starliner wanted?
Yes, I think we're gonna talk about Starliner and some commercial crew updates in a little bit, and we're definitely gonna have to talk about that. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
All right. Cleared it out of the queue, and that's why, because we're going to do it later. On SLS, do you think later versions of SLS will be dock capable to Starship? This is from Tychon Daroga.
I mean, we know what future versions of SLS are there, and the big one that could be the final upgrade is the Block 2, right? Upgrade with the exploration upper stage, which is fairly capable. It's not as capable as Starship to low Earth orbit, but in a single launch perspective, it actually has some very good capabilities. And so, yeah, it's a cool thing.
And regarding to docking the Starship, and that actually comes down to the Orion spacecraft. Orion is kind of very close to its final design on Artemis 1. I think it's missing some life support systems and things that aren't needed until a crewed test flight. But for the most part, it's pretty much the final version. And Orion will be able to dock to the lunar version of Starship, the human landing system variant. And that's because Starship is designed to either dock to Orion or the Lunar Gateway, depending on where in the program we are. And that's how it will transfer its crew. And that will not change, like you said, as Adrian goes through the launch vehicle upgrades, Block 1B with the upper stage, and then Block 2 with some potential booster upgrades. That will not change the docking capability, which will pretty much already be there.
It totally misunderstood this question, by the way, and skipped over the docking and only saw capabilities. Sorry for that.
We do have a question here that's pretty broad, and it might be good for us to sort of cover what the overall mission of SLS is again. And this is going to say, are these SLS flights manned?
Right. So SLS, when it first began, and SLS was first pitched in, I think early, like 2011 was when it might have been originally announced, although development work goes back farther than that. The idea of leveraging some shuttle hardware, the shuttle main engines, the shuttle boosters, shuttle tank technology, those kind of things, and then also taking the Orion spacecraft, which came from the Constellation program, with the precursor to Artemis, and those things kind of leveraging all of those technologies that had started development and creating a crewed launch vehicle that can go beyond low Earth orbit. But the SLS rocket was also going to be multi-purpose. It was going to be able to launch very heavy uncrewed payloads, science missions to deep space, station modules, things like that. For the Lunar Gateway, moon landers themselves. But as a result of the delays that have gone through this program, and the SLS has been the SLS has been, oh no, I'm forgetting the word, subject to many delays over the course of its very long development history. It's a brand new rocket. It's a very large rocket. So say what you want, but some of that is not entirely unreasonable. As a result of those delays, a lot of those missions that aren't the crewed missions have been moved to other vehicles. There are commercial launch vehicles such as Falcon Heavy that can launch really big, heavy, uncrewed payloads and science missions. For example, the Europa Clipper mission was originally pretty much mandated to launch on SLS, and that mission has since been moved off of SLS and will launch on a Falcon Heavy. So those kind of missions have been moved away from SLS. And then in the future, when SLS gets to that Block 1B configuration we were talking about with a bigger upper stage, it will still have the ability to carry a gateway module or extra cargo along with Orion to the moon. So that capability is still there and may still be utilized. However, the main focus of SLS are these crewed missions, getting crew into the Orion spacecraft and delivering that crew to lunar orbit, where we'll meet with the Lunar Gateway Station, meet with a lander, go to the surface, or just stay in lunar orbit and do science on Gateway or in orbit on its own. That is the main purpose of SLS. It's the only vehicle that we have in late stages of development that can deliver a crew spacecraft to lunar orbit. Spacecraft like Crew Dragon, Starliner are low Earth orbit vehicles, and in order to even get them to lunar orbit, you would have to put them on much larger vehicles and crew rate that system, which is not the easiest thing to do. You'd also have to modify the vehicles themselves. So it's the Orion spacecraft and the SLS rocket getting crew to lunar orbit. It will do one uncrewed test flight, Artemis 1, and then starting with Artemis 2, there will be crew on board for a crewed test flight, very similar to how commercial crew did an uncrewed and a crewed test flight prior to actual operational missions.
We had about $10 come in from Rough Riders who asked that, so now that they have the vehicle fully stacked, why so long for a wet dress rehearsal or rollout?
Yeah, so there's a good bit of testing that still has to be done. Now that it's stacked, they'll do some testing in the VAB. I don't believe we actually have a fully updated time for rollout itself, but after even between rollout and the wet dress rehearsal, there will also be lots of time for testing and things like that prior to the actual WDR. Also keep in mind, I mean, we're at the end of October right now, and during the December timeframe, you have a lot of time where there's going to be limited workforce due to the holidays. So reality, to get between now in January is kind of just over 1 month of work, really. You have all of November, and you have a little bit of October and a little bit in December. So less than 2 months, really, until you're in January. So we're a lot closer to that than you think. But there is just additional testing that has to be done after stacking here in the VAB, and then getting prepared to actually roll the rocket out.
Got it. We've had a couple questions on one topic. I'm going to pick the one from Robbie Rob here. At NASASpaceflight, I remember the SRBs having a lifetime of about 1 year after stacking, which happened at the beginning of this year. Are they going to make the deadline, or are they going to have to replace them?
Most likely they will, if I recall correctly, will make the not the deadline. I think it was like very early in the year, right? But there's a possibility, of course, with these things that they basically get a waiver and extend the period in which these SRBs can be used and can be flown. So yes, the original time frame will probably pass, but that doesn't mean the SRBs suddenly are not usable anymore.
Right. The 12-month kind of lifetime was kind of it is the shelf life, if you will, once they are stacked. It's actually the lifetime of the seals they use to stack each segment to one another. So it's like once you put the first segment on the launcher, that timer hasn't started yet. But as soon as you put the second segment and seal it to the first, then your timer starts. And that is approximately 12 months. However, Northrop Grumman, who is the prime contractor for the boosters, and NASA engineers have already evaluated the seals, done some extra engineering work and testing, and I believe added either a 3 or 6 month extension to that seal lifetime. So if they get a very significant delay, we would be talking about that again. But the engineers have already looked at all the data. They're very confident that it's a non-issue, and they have actually extended that deadline already, so shouldn't be a problem.
Got it. We have a couple little comments here. Danny McCool gave $5. Thank you so much for that. Can we mute Thomas when he brings up the silly rocket?
What's up, Daniel? I know him, and it's a fair point. I'm not going to be on the show this next week, so you guys are going to be spared the Ares 1 talk probably. Maybe I have to get Ian on. He's an Ares 1 fan club member. He'll represent.
And also
Oh.
for you, Thomas, real quick, is that capsule in your shirt Mercury or Gemini?
Oh, this is a Gemini shirt. For those of you fans of the Vsauce YouTube channel, this is a shirt from them, and it's kind of a cool constellation thing with Gemini on the bottom. So it's the Gemini capsule today. Gemini, chat, debate how it's pronounced. I don't think we figured that out yet.
Adrian, were you about to have a comment?
I was just about to say that we already discovered there are 2 Ares 1 fans. That's already one more than it flew.
There are dozens. Dozens. Let's see. From Lucas G. Does NASA have to get its vehicles approved by the FAA for human flight, and I guess no need for environmental assessment for the Cape?
That we were actually just talking about this, Adrian, the other day. So the first part of the section about the FAA kind of crewing things, this has become very prevalent because people have been talking about FAA approval for Starship and things like that. However, when it is a government-operated vehicle, SLS for example, this also went back for like the shuttle program, those vehicles don't need like an FAA launch license. It is licensed by a different government agency, in this case NASA. So government-operated vehicles do not actually require FAA launch licenses. The FAA is still involved in the process. The FAA still helps coordinate airspace closures and things like that, but they don't get the same commercial launch licenses that, for example, SpaceX, ULA, other launch providers need for their rockets. And then for the second part about the environmental assessment, Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center, there are dozens of environmental assessments that have been done for different launch pads and things. There was an environmental assessment, I believe, for the SLS program, or they were able to carry over a lot of the data from the shuttle program and things like that. But that's already been handled. It's not like the Starship program where we're kind of waiting for that as a major hurdle before first flight. That's already been handled by the relevant authorities.
Let's see here. From Benny, what are the chances of seeing SLS and Falcon Heavy on the 39 pads next to each other? And I knew we'd find a way to slip in SpaceX here.
Yeah, it's not that small actually. With many Falcon Heavy launches scheduled in the next year, there is a pretty good chance with A, the wet dress rehearsal, and B, the actual launch of SLS happening next year, that we will have the opportunity to see Falcon Heavy and SLS on the launch pad together in the same shot, which will be an amazing shot, I bet.
At the very least, because SLS will sit on the pad for a while for that wet dress, I hope, even if it's like a Falcon 9 instead of a Falcon Heavy, I hope there's something at 39A, because seeing multiple rockets rolled out at once is always cool. And if we really want to get greedy, the next pad south is pad 41, if ULA has an Atlas to roll out, or Vulcan for that matter. I think there's some potential for, Rocket Row type images. We'll have to see.
We have sort of an interesting question here. I don't know if we're the ones to answer it. From Michael Terada, who asks, the Senate approved $579 million this year for SLS exploration upper stages engine development. Hasn't the RL-10 been flying since 1961? What's left to develop?
Michael, that is a very good question. Yes, the exploration upper stage uses the RL-10 engine, which has been flying since the 60s. It flew on Saturn V. It has been flying on the Centaur line of stages for a very long time. On the Delta upper stages, it's on SLS, and on the current SLS upper stage and the upcoming exploration upper stage. And well, yeah, yeah, very good point. Good point, Michael. I don't know.
And who is doing the development?
The RL-10 is an engine produced by Aerojet Rocketdyne, so they are probably the contract holder for that. The prime contractor for the stage itself, I believe, is Boeing. So it's either through Boeing or through Aerojet Rocketdyne. There is a render of that exploration upper stage with 4 RL-10 engines.
I'm sure that they are using it appropriately. Is this a functional Orion on top or a simulator?
Nope, this is the real deal. Go ahead, Adrian.
Yeah, basically the same what you said.
Real deal. It might be missing some life support things or something like that, but it's got functional solar panels, engines, thrusters. I think life support's kind of the only thing I could think of that might not be fully fleshed out like it will be for the next one.
Okay, and then just some quick thank yous real quick to Musical Wolves, to Tycon and Jim. Thank you all very much for doing some tips to the show. We really appreciate that. Helps keep things running around here. One more question here on SLS. Why Ares 1X has the letter X? Is it an acronym of or experimental?
Kind of. So the Ares 1X was the name of one specific test flight, and it was a suborbital launch. It's the only launch that ever happened for, well, not for the Constellation program, because Constellation also did a pad abort test. But the Ares 1 program, it was a suborbital test, only testing a 4-segment first stage instead of a 5-segment first stage that actually would have flown for orbital missions. And the upper stage in Orion was like a mass simulator, a dummy thing. So it was a suborbital test flight for the rocket development program, and it would have been followed by Ares 1Y, which was also called Ares 1X Prime. The naming scheme in early Constellation was not great, which would have been like an in-flight abort test, and then Ares 1 would have gone to orbit after that. So Ares 1 is the name of the actual rocket. Ares 1X is a designation for the one test flight and the one test vehicle that actually flew. I don't think the X came from experimental. I think it's just, I mean, maybe, but it was followed by Ares 1Y, so I don't know how exactly that ties in. I'll have to check.
Sometimes in spaceflight, it's just cool to throw the letter X into something.
Yeah, it just looks cool, right? Yeah.
Let's see. Michael asks, is any part of the SLS rocket and boosters reusable?
Adrian, want to field that one?
I don't think so, right? Like-
So, I mean, depends on what you mean by reusable. Nothing on, well, nothing except for the Orion capsule, obviously, will get recovered intact. Debris might survive reentry and get fished out in that sense, but the boosters aren't going to be in one piece during recovery. The core stage for sure. I don't know if the core stage will even make it to the ground, because core stage is going to experience a very high energy reentry. But for the most part, nothing gets really recovered intact except for the capsule at the very end of the mission. But they are reusing previously flown hardware on the mission. All the 4 main engines on the core stage previously supported shuttle missions, and they're getting kind of a blaze of glory, a Viking burial, if you will, with one last launch to the moon, which I think is kind of cool. So they are reusing those engines, but this will be their last flight. And the same thing goes for a bunch of the segments of the solid rocket boosters. A bunch of them have flown before. There's some segments that are brand new, but some segments have been used on previously stacked boosters on the shuttle program because those were recovered and available for reuse. And that will continue for the first few SLS launches.
Got it. Last call here for SLS questions, by the way. Just a couple more minutes before we move on into the next segment. We do have a couple more. Why won't there be an in-flight abort test for SLS? Won't there be one?
Well, there kind of was already. There was a test called the Ascent Abort 2, which was an Orion spacecraft launch abort system on board basically just a small solid rocket booster. Instead of doing an in-flight abort with an entire SLS rocket, which was very large, very expensive to build, and then during an in-flight abort test only gets used for like a minute before you bail on it and let it disintegrate. That what they said that was an unreasonable way to do an in-flight abort test. So they did a pad abort test with the launch escape system, and they did an in-flight abort on the Ascent Abort 2 mission, which was an Orion capsule on just a small solid rocket booster to get to the same altitude and speed that it would on an SLS mission. So they did do an in-flight abort test. It's already done. It was very successful. They just didn't do it on a full-up SLS rocket.
Is there any concern around them not being able to really test all the different systems repeatedly and all together because of the cost and size of SLS, or is that not really so much of an issue?
I think it's a trade-off because there's also benefits to you're leveraging a lot of hardware that flew throughout the shuttle program. So you have a lot of flight data and a lot of engineering data to tell you exactly how all those components are going to perform in different flight regimes. So there's a lot of reliability that comes out of that information. Yes, obviously there's still value to a full-up test flight, which is basically what Artemis 1 is. And then Artemis 2, you put humans in the loop and add any last, life support systems like we talked about for the fullest up test flight, if you will. And then you move into operational missions after that. There won't be another full up abort test, sure, but they have tested those systems independently, and they have done the analog tests for pad abort and in-flight abort, which have all gone very well. So that's a sufficient amount of data to be very confident in those systems.
Also, correct me if I'm wrong, but at first the green light wasn't the green run test wasn't even planned. They decided under Bridenstine that they still wanted to do this now and want to do a full green run test, which initially wasn't part of the testing program at all.
Right, that was not always a firm part of that testing plan, and Bridenstine was a big part in solidifying that, and so a lot of data came from that campaign as well.
We're going to do one more question here. Real this time. Christopher Blinson asks, how often will SLS fly once this thing actually gets up?
We don't know for sure at this point because it's always depending on how long, for example, the Artemis program is ongoing and how many missions it gets assigned. I think so far it's 3 that are fixed planned, right? Artemis 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, those are all pretty solid. The fact is, there's also forward work on future missions. I think up through like Artemis 12 or something, like very early procurement of parts and things like that. So they've got several missions in work, but yeah, it does depend on the fate of the program. I believe the launch cadence they're kind of looking for in the near term is once a year, maybe getting up to twice a year if they can manage. But a lot of that's going to come from how the early test flights go and how quickly alternative launch vehicles come online. Cough, cough, Starship. So we'll have to wait and see.
Okay. And Octavian would like to clear up with $5, and thank you very much for that. We really do appreciate it. SLS Stage 0 is reusable.
This is true. The ground equipment's mostly reusable.
I mean, if they will replace a lot of it for the exploration upper stage, because they need a new tower.
That is a good point. The launch tower they are currently going to use is only really good for like 3 launches right now, because the Artemis 4 will be the first with a new upper stage. That's the current plan. And that requires a whole new launch tower. So reusable 3 times.
All right, so moving on from SLS, we're talking a little bit about Lucy, which is on its way to some asteroids. Lucy is in cruise mode, and it's mostly deployed. Why is it mostly deployed?
Yeah, so there was an issue that came up after launch with one of the solar arrays, which so far we don't know how much it is deployed. We know that the whole vehicle is power positive, so it's not like it's running out of power right now. But one of the 2 solar arrays is not fully deployed right now, and how much of an issue that is later in the mission, and if they maybe can fix it, that is currently what they're assessing right now. We don't have any word right now if this impacts the mission.
Before we head too deeply into Lucy, it's going over to the what was it? The Trojan asteroids. Could we just give a quick recap on what its mission is over there?
Sure. So the Trojan asteroids are these 2 groups of asteroids that orbit the sun at the same distance as Jupiter approximately, but ahead of and behind the planet. And these clumps of asteroids kind of collect there as a result of how Jupiter and the sun's gravity interact at these things called Lagrange points. It's just it's a physics term for these points in an orbit. And so Lucy is on a trajectory that's going to take it to Lagrange points ahead of and behind of Jupiter, the L4 and the L5 points for those familiar with the terms. And it's going to fly by 8 different asteroids overall, 7 of which are in those Lagrange points, those belts. The first of which is actually on the way to the first clump. So there's an extra asteroid on the way. But it is flying by 8 asteroids, and is going to be the first mission to see these particular groups of asteroids, and they could be very useful for determining things like how planets have formed in our solar system and things like that. These asteroids are of very high interest to planetary scientists, and thus the rationale behind the Lucy mission.
Quick little point here from Tony Jebsen, which is kind of cool. The first asteroid it flies by is Donald Johnson, the discoverer of the Lucy hominid.
Yes.
And
that is the asteroid that's kind of on the way to the L4 Trojans, which you're seeing kind of the map of the trajectory on your screen now. It's somewhere like quite halfway between Earth and Jupiter's orbit. So yeah.
I think we see it, right? It's the white.
It's that little white
dot.
dot, I believe, is supposed to indicate that. Yeah.
Musical Wolves and Ethan Hughes both have the same sort of question here, and $2 to Musical Wolves. Thank you very much. Could NASA see Lucy now or later on a flyby to check the solar panel, or could it do a rescue capture, or is it on its way?
So it does do a pair of Earth flybys as part of this trajectory to help boost its orbit out to the altitude of Jupiter. Not at any distance where we should like point a telescope at it or anything. It's a pretty small spacecraft. However, there are other methods that they are working on determining how much of the solar panel is actually deployed. They have confirmation that one of the panels latched, which is how they know it fully deployed, but the other one did not latch, which is why they have been indicated that it is not necessarily fully deployed. It is power positive, and what that means is it is generating more power than it currently needs. So that's not an immediate concern. The main way they're looking at determining how close it is to fully deployed is figuring out how much energy is it actually generating, because that will tell you, how much of the solar array surface area is deployed. So that's what they're working on right now and how they're moving through this assessment. Once they figure that out, they will look at options for, does it need to be the rest of the way deployed, or is it fine how it is? If it does need some additional work, what kind of options do they have? And I believe they have hinted that they do have some options, but they're still working on that assessment to figure out what exactly their best plan is going to be.
So this isn't necessarily a deal breaker for the Lucy mission. They could still
No.
continue as planned.
Nope.
Okay.
There will be a little bit of less energy that these solar panels generate when they get closer to Jupiter because it's farther out from the sun. But it could still be the case because there is most likely a margin here that it has enough power to fulfill its mission.
And what's going to happen to Lucy after its mission? From Kieran Riley.
It's a very good question. So, like most science missions and deep space missions that NASA flies, they have a initial mission, which, like we mentioned, for Lucy is a flyby of 8 different asteroids, and it's over 12 years. If the spacecraft is still functioning healthily and still has propellant, fuel for another word, after that 12-year mission is complete, they will look at its trajectory, and that trajectory is stable for like hundreds of years or something, and say, all right, what are we going to fly by next? Or what could we fly by next with some very small maneuvering? And they could identify potential targets for additional flybys and continue the science as long as the spacecraft allows. And that's something called an extended mission. And many of NASA's science missions outlast their lifetimes and get to produce even more science in an extended mission. Lucy is less of a guarantee for that because its primary mission is already 12 years long. However, it would not be unreasonable for Lucy to survive that and be able to do some additional science afterwards, which is a decision that happens once the primary mission is complete. But for context, things like the Mars rovers, like Spirit and Opportunity, were each supposed to just live like 90 days or something, and they lasted years. So things like that are pretty common actually in NASA missions.
Before we continue on this topic, I want to do a quick thank you to Conan James Evans for $10, to Andrew R. for $5, and Christopher Blinson for becoming a new member of the Red Team. Thank you all very, very much. We appreciate your support of the channel. Going on to Lucy again, every time some expensive scientific hardware gets launched, it does give everybody a little bit of a bellyache. Michael Tirada asks, well, Lucy's issues making me even more nervous about the James Webb deployment. What do you think the chances are of a clean deployment of that far more complex spacecraft?
100% because I don't want to believe anything else.
Pure willpower will get those panels unfolded. So James Webb, and some people have actually asked about this. James Webb does not have any hardware commonality with the Lucy mission. It doesn't use the same solar panels or anything like that. So James Webb will not have that as a risk. However, it is not unfair to say that, yeah, it's a little risky to send these really complicated missions, especially on trajectories that don't come back. The Lucy mission is a Earth escape trajectory. You can't go out and fix it if something's wrong with it. And the same applies to the James Webb Telescope, which is going to a different Lagrange point, but one of Earth's Lagrange points. And once it's out there, once it's released from the Ariane 5 rocket, it is not going to be accessible. Now, they did put grappling points on James Webb, So in theory, if you could get a spacecraft the delta V to get there, the change of velocity, the trajectory it needs, something like Northrop Grumman's mission extension vehicles or something like that, a robotic vehicle, it is not entirely impossible, but it would be very difficult. But if James Webb got out there and there was a major problem, I would be surprised if they didn't at least investigate what their options were. But the much more preferred option is that that's not necessary. I think we're all going to be very nervous for the James Webb launch. It's a very high profile mission. We're very invested in the science that it can do and the inspiration it can offer. I mean, think of all the people who have gotten interested in space after seeing Hubble Space Telescope images. And James Webb is, in some ways, a successor to Hubble, although it does some different types of astronomy. But either way, it's a very high profile mission that we're all wishing the absolute best for success of, and we'll all be very nervous as a result. But I don't think we should connect it to the Lucy issue. No hardware commonality there. So from an engineering perspective, I wouldn't connect the two.
Get ready, by the way, for the heat shield deployment of James Webb Space Telescope on Christmas Eve. So
Yes.
if it launches as it's planned right now, the heat shield deployment of James Webb Space Telescope is on Christmas Eve.
Been told that James Webb has plot armor, so it should be fine. When was Lucy started to be put together and developed?
Oh man. You know, I'm not sure. I can do a quick Google job if you two can like stall for a second.
I would just be interested to know how long it took to build versus how long it's taken the James Webb to build, and which one would be considered newer.
All right, let's see. Lucy was chosen by NASA for a mission in January of 2017, which means that the spacecraft likely was not built before then. So no earlier than 2017 it was started, and for comparison, I know James Webb is older, but I'll get you a date here. James Webb, early development, well, no, that doesn't count. I'm reading Wikipedia, full disclosure. It, all right, so James Webb originated under a different name called the Next Generation Space Telescope in 1996.
So you don't necessarily need to interpret it as it's running on older hardware as much as they've had longer time to test it.
Sure, let's go with that.
I don't know that we do have another question here for Lucy, and do ask them if you have different questions. From Salar Ascari, how close will Lucy get to Earth in its 3-time circle-shaped path?
They're not super close flybys. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's, I think, several
have
hundreds
it.
of kilometers. Do you?
Yeah, it's 300 kilometers on 16th October 2022, 350 kilometers in 2024, and 660 kilometers in 2030.
So the first two of those are 300 something kilometers. That's closer than the ISS actually orbits. So that's actually pretty close. And then the 600 one is a slightly higher orbit, but those are all in the low Earth orbit altitude. So I take that back. Those are actually pretty close flybys.
Yeah, at least according to Wikipedia.
Wikipedia is a very trusted source. Everyone knows this.
Could Lucy accidentally hit a big asteroid? Does it have microthrusters to make small adjustments like that? These things aren't really super close together, right? It's not like they're going to a Star Wars asteroid field.
Right, yeah. Asteroid fields aren't what they look like in movies and things like that. It's not, you don't like when NASA sends missions through the asteroid belt and out to distant planets, they don't really even check if they're going to hit an asteroid because the odds of that happening accidentally are effectively zero. There's still lots of empty space out there. So an accidental collision isn't really a thing that's plausible.
You just destroyed my sci-fi imagination. Thanks, Thomas.
All right, listen,
Well-
all you have to do is disintegrate a planet and then you'll have a clump of asteroids that are really close together, okay?
Nice,
There's a
thank you.
solution.
Noted.
Might be worth doing just for the sci-fi future that we all want. Why are they called? Well, actually, we went over Lucy, but why the James Webb Telescope? What's the name of it?
So James Webb was the NASA administrator during the kind of the meat of the Apollo program and the buildup of the Apollo program. So it was named after a very successful administrator for NASA as an agency very early on in its program. It is also worth noting that you may have heard about this naming a little bit recently, and it would be amiss to not mention it, because there is some controversy about some practices that were prevalent throughout the agency under Webb's direction, regarding minority groups, sexual orientation groups, and things like that, that were not treated possibly that very fairly in those times. So there's been some push to try and get it renamed, and maybe that'll happen. It is, of course, sometimes difficult to separate the accomplishments of someone that you want to thank for their service for the agency from things that they also may have been doing that were less than praisable. That's not a word. Less than good. So there's some controversy there. But that is the person that the telescope is named after, and I highly encourage reading up on it a little bit and seeing what the full story is.
And Tommy, since that was your question, just cover it again real quick. Lucy is named after the early human ancestor hominid Lucy, who's in turn named after a Beatles song.
Yes.
So there you go.
And the reason that the Lucy mission is named after that fossil is that the Lucy fossil was very important for us connecting kind of a very early part in human evolution, much like we hope the Trojan asteroids will help us understand the very early phases of planetary development. So there's the connection.
So these are sort of fossils of the entire solar system.
Exactly. Yep.
Now let's move on from Lucy a little bit. There is a small little indie rocket company making a program called Starliner. What's going on with that?
Small little indie rocket company. That's one way to describe Boeing, I'm sure. But yeah, the Starliner program, we got a little bit of an update regarding Starliner. In fact, I'm going to pull up my notes so I don't mess this up. But the latest that we are hearing is that they've got some valves to do some testing on. They have identified a possible root cause, although they have not confirmed it yet. That's some humidity from Florida, because, well, they are in Florida, so this makes a lot of sense. Somehow got into some of the valves in the service module, reacted with some oxidizer, some propellant in that system, which resulted in some corrosion and the valve stopping working. And how that humidity got in is kind of the big question right now. Obviously, they're supposed to be watertight, so that doesn't happen. So they're working on some testing at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and the White Sands test facility with those valves, which have been removed from the service module, to confirm the root cause and corrective action. They've also already started implementing some corrective actions and preventative things to prevent the issue from occurring again. But that is the issue that they are currently working before its next uncrewed test flight. That flight, the Orbital Flight Test 2, is currently targeted for the first half of 2022, so not till next year. And the crewed flight test will happen no earlier than about 6 months after that. So even on a very optimistic schedule, the odds of Starliner getting its first crewed mission is likely into 2023. And this is, of course, the second ISS crew transport vehicle alongside SpaceX and Crew Dragon, launching on Atlas V rockets, and hoping to get that online as soon as possible. But for now, Crew Dragon will be the ISS crew transport vehicle until Starliner can complete its last couple test flights.
Doesn't seem like Starliner's having a very good time.
Starliner has had some difficult going at it. It's had some software issues on the first orbital flight test, hence the second one. Now the second one is having these valve issues. And of course, it is not entirely fair to criticize it too harshly because it is a development program. Space is hard, developing new crew vehicles is hard, and that is part of why things like Boeing Starliner, the SLS program, have encountered some delays because you want to make sure you do it right, especially when there's crew on board. But luckily, they had two different providers, and SpaceX was able to complete its development quicker. So we do have that crew transport capability. Now it's just about expanding that to two vehicles. And so Starliner and Boeing have some time to get that right, and hopefully it won't be too much longer.
2023, Adrian. What are your thoughts on that?
Is that past even the most likely timing of the sixth mission that would go in the rotation?
So yeah, so both Boeing and SpaceX got 6 operational missions contracted. SpaceX launches Crew 3 a week from tomorrow. Crew 4 is in the spring, so Crew 5 in the fall of 2022. Crew 6 will be in spring of 2023.
So most likely, we are in a situation now where SpaceX will complete at least 5, maybe even 6 missions before Starliner is fully certified for operational work. And I think while I still think it's great that we have 2 providers and both are basically making sure to develop a vehicle. For Boeing, I bet this is not what they expected when they went into this contract, that they would be beaten by 5 to 6 missions by SpaceX. So it's not optimal, but it's great that these issues come up before crew test flight, because always it's good to find these things before you put crew into a vehicle. It's bad when it's happened when people are in there.
It's also worth mentioning that, remember, SpaceX at one point in Crew Dragon development exploded a Crew Dragon capsule. After the Demo 1 mission, that capsule was supposed to be reused on the in-flight abort test. During some ground testing, supposed to be a test abort engine firing, the capsule exploded and disintegrated. And SpaceX still won, and at that point we all assumed that Boeing was going to be the first one to deliver crew to the station. But it turns out we were wrong on that, because these development programs are unpredictable at times. But yeah, on the front of the future of commercial crew, and we have talked about this on previous episodes, NASA has now begun requesting information about the next set of missions, talking to both SpaceX and Boeing as well, but also additional companies. Think companies like Sierra Nevada, who is developing the Dream Chaser spacecraft, which is currently slated to just be a cargo vehicle, but the crew variant is something that's been proposed in the past. Blue Origin has proposed orbital crew transport vehicles in the past. There are other options out there to start development of additional crew vehicles for low Earth orbit, and NASA has actually put out what's called a request for information from interested companies to try and start gauging what the path forward for additional missions after the original commercial crew missions are. And we'll be interested to see what comes from that. It is not the same as a request for proposals. They're not asking for, okay, bid for these launch services. It's requesting information like, what are your thoughts on this program? How would you go about it? How should we structure the program to best work with the commercial providers and things like that? But that process is in work, and we are going to hopefully before too long start hearing about additional commercial crew missions for SpaceX for sure, possibly Boeing, possibly new providers.
I think at this point it is almost given that SpaceX will probably get an extension to their contract.
That's probably the most certain outcome, yes.
Yeah. Could even, I'm not even sure if we don't know that, but in the case of Starliner becoming available, could it support 2 launches a year? Is that in the cadence? Is that possible?
I believe so, yes. I believe that's in the capabilities. Because remember, the Starliner spacecraft are reusable. Boeing plans to operate a fleet of the Starliner capsules, and ULA is able to support, 2 Atlas V launches a year pretty easily, especially for such a high-profile mission as maintaining the International Space Station. So, yeah, that's definitely within its capabilities.
Okay, so still NASA could decide that they still want 2 capsules to fly, for example, and
yes.
And add SpaceX missions, because right now SpaceX only has 6 missions in the contract, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, we've got quite a few questions about this, and most of them mention SpaceX at the same time.
Sure.
Very clever chat. How would Humidity affect Starliner but not the Falcon missions? What is it that Starliner is doing differently?
So Humidity getting into the wrong systems would affect, any spacecraft. This isn't a thing unique to Starliner. The problem here is that Humidity got someplace that it was not designed to get to. There's some failure of some kind allowed water to get somewhere that was supposed to be watertight. So it's not that Humidity wouldn't affect other missions, it's just that these valves were not properly protected from the outside humidity, which is what they're working on fixing now.
We've already talked about SLS, but tying back to that just a little bit, Dank Jeb says Boeing builds both Starliner and SLS. Do Starliner's problems make you concerned for SLS?
No. Actually, it doesn't make me nervous, because I bet that these are completely different teams who are working on completely different vehicles, and I don't think there will be a direct connection between these 2. Also, SLS is on pretty heavy oversight by NASA as well, so I'm sure if they give either of these vehicles a go to with their missions, they are pretty sure that it's a good chance that it will fly well.
Joe Pipple requests that we reflect on how amazing the Apollo program was when we see the delays with SLS and Starliner for years now.
Worth reiterating the context of the Apollo program had a lot more money, which solves a lot of problems. But yeah, the Apollo program is not the norm for development schedules. This is what we were experiencing on modern day programs. There's a lot of engineering that goes into spaceflight hardware, and it all has to pretty much work right, especially when you're putting humans on board. So delays are always better than, anomalies later down the road.
At the risk of summoning Chris, how long was the development program or the time period for shuttle?
And I will get to Googling on that because I am not named Chris and thus don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of our favorite
Shuttle.
I'm already looking at chat because I expect Christy to answer the question in just a second.
Let's see. I mean, so there was some precursor things. Looks like one of the main studies that kind of started the shuttle program started in 1966. And the head of the Office of Manned Spaceflight at the time announced a plan in 68. Yeah, so it looks like, on all intents and purposes, Space Shuttle started in 1968, with first flight was in 1981. So just 13 years. Right? Yes.
Okay. Let's see here. From Marcus. Any missions that are locked in for Starliner?
Yeah, six basically right now.
Yep.
They have 6 contract missions in the commercial crew program. Also, of course, the second uncrewed demo and the first crewed demo, which are also locked into that contract. So basically, you have 8 flights, which are currently in the manifest of Starliner.
And only those 8. There are no external commercial missions for Starliner currently in the manifest.
How do you think they're feeling having contracted Starliner?
Well, I mean, unless there's a significant risk that it never gets to the finish line, which I think is not a very probable outcome, they will get those 6 missions out of them. And beyond that, there's some, there's some shakiness regarding Atlas V may be retired in the not too distant future, and if Starliner program continues, it needs a new launch vehicle at some point. So if there's many missions beyond that, not sure. But certainly the program has not gone as smoothly as many have liked. I don't believe it's been a regret. There were not many other even better options out there. Sierra Nevada has failed to deliver a cargo Dream Chaser, and that is behind schedule. So trusting them with a crewed variant might not have resulted in much better than Starliner. And there were other concepts such as continuing to fly the space shuttle, which while would have been cool, would have been very expensive and could have caused safety issues. There were things like Ares 1, or variants of Ares 1 like the Liberty rocket, which had some Ares 1 heritage to it, but those plans were not very confidence-inducing. There were limited options when going to commercially operated orbital human spaceflight vehicles, because those are a new thing and it's difficult to do. So I don't think there's any regrets or anything contracting Starliner. I think they made a very good decision with the 2 that they chose. I think Starliner is just showing some challenges in that last stage of the development.
Before we move on, any final thoughts, Thomas or Adrian, on SLS? Not SLS, I'm sorry, Starliner. Where are we?
I think we kind of covered it. I just wishing the best and hoping that once they're resolved, Starliner can fulfill its duty,
Okay.
Same.
We're going to move on to a different space program, but before we do, I want to thank to Peter West for becoming a Red Team member. Thank you very much for that and supporting the channel. We greatly appreciate it. And Jonathan Kapowski has a couple of really good program agnostic questions that I would love us to cover. He asks, first of all, how many countries have their own vehicles to fly humans to space right now? And how far? Like LEO, ISS, Moon, Mars?
All right.
So,
Go ahead,
China,
Adrian, you start. Yep.
We have China who can launch to low Earth orbit. We have Russia who can launch to low Earth orbit. We have America with the US with one vehicle that can launch to LEO with crew. And I think that's it, right? That's the current capabilities.
Those are the 3 operational vehicles, being Shenzhou, Soyuz, and Crew Dragon. And obviously both Soyuz and Crew Dragon can get to the International Space Station, specifically, not just LEO. The Shenzhou vehicle can physically get to the International Space Station, and actually, I have to double check on this. I believe the plan was for the new Chinese space station to use the same docking standards as the ISS does, and thus, technically, a Shenzhou can actually dock to the ISS. I might have to check on that. It might need an adapter or something, but in theory, they could probably do that. So all those 3 countries capable of getting to LEO and to the ISS. When you add some vehicles that are in like the final stages of development, obviously Starliner adds a LEO vehicle, SLS adds a moon vehicle, at least lunar orbit. It needs to dock with a lander of some kind. I don't believe that either Russia or China have beyond low Earth orbit vehicles in advanced stages of development. They have concepts and they have plans, but they're very early in development, so I wouldn't, really reference them. India also has a low Earth orbit crew vehicle in development, but that's also not particularly close to being operational.
So there's this shiny rocket, and which is standing in South Texas right now.
Right, that other rocket that we're going to talk about in a minute.
Texas is its own country.
Hey, it was at one point. But yeah, Starship is also a low Earth orbit and ISS and Moon and Mars vehicle. Wherever you want to apply it, Starship has some capability there. So Starship is also not super close to being operational, but closer than some of the Russian and Chinese plans.
And Kip's second question here: there seems to be many space companies. Exactly what are they doing differently or the same? Exactly. Every single one of them now.
Okay, let's go. How many time do you have?
In broad strokes, yeah.
Yeah, I think especially with these small set launchers, you see a lot of them trying to find a unique selling point, which they really want to focus on. For example, with Astra, you always have them highlighting that they basically can launch anywhere where they have a concrete pad. Mm-hmm. And that's one of these examples where they really try to highlight what is our unique selling point, why are we the ones you should look at. And that is understandable because there's a wide range of these right now, and you need to have some sort of special thing that makes you more competitive than the others to, be the one that is maybe in the end surviving.
There's a lot, the not characteristics, the performances that all these commercial launch providers are striving for are, low cost, high reliability, high launch cadence, high flexibility, those kind of things with regards to where and when you'll launch, and how often you can launch, things like that. But there are many different approaches to accomplishing those things. Some companies say reusability helps lower the cost and also improves reliability because you're flying vehicles that have flown before. Whereas other companies say we'd rather scale production of cheaply built rockets and expendable rockets, and that's how we'll achieve a high launch cadence and low costs and things like that. And also, if you have a large manufacturing cadence, you'll have a lot of data. If you fly often, that'll improve your reliability. Things like that. Also, there's some discrepancies as to what payload classes different companies want to cater to. Some companies want to help support small satellite missions. Other companies want to launch big satellites. Other companies want to launch humans and cargo spacecraft. Other companies want to develop landers for the moon and Mars. So different companies are pursuing different missions and different markets. And other companies are, kind of aiming towards similar markets as other companies, but doing so in different ways with regards to reusability or rocket size or manufacturing and things like that.
So SpaceX has a mission that's really, really focused on reusability. Mm-hmm. Blue Origin has a mission that's really, really focused on suing people. And Boeing has a mission that provides really, really good lobbyist dinners. Talking about South Korea now. Let's move on. Just going to drop that and let it hang.
That's feeling spicy today. I love it.
Just a little bit. South Korea has launched a new rocket. Why is that interesting?
Well, it's interesting because South Korea has not had a domestic orbital launch capability for a little bit. This is not the first time they have. This is the KSLV-2 rocket, which was preceded by the original KSLV. However, the first KSLV rocket was actually using a lot of Russian hardware and was kind of co-developed with Russian space program. And so, yes, it was a Korean like operated vehicle, but it wasn't really fully domestically developed. This vehicle is 100% Korean technology. And so it's the first, they're calling it like the first fully homegrown South Korean rocket. The original KSLV flew 3 times, the first 2 of which did not reach orbit. It took 3 tries to reach orbit, but South Korea did become the, I believe, 11th country and also the most recent country actually to domestically launch a satellite. But since then, they have moved into this new KSLV-2 rocket, and it had its maiden flight earlier this week. The flight went relatively well, all things considered. In fact, the South Korean space program kind of gave it a 30% chance of success, which is kind of pessimistic if you think about it. Although maiden launches of new vehicles are very unlikely to succeed perfectly the first time. And this launch was no different. It is a 3-stage rocket. The first 2 stages did very well, but the third stage shut down early. The cause is still under investigation. However, it did not quite reach orbit. All it carried was a mass simulator on board, no operational satellites, and that mass simulator and the final third stage both re-entered less than an hour or so after launch. Did not achieve orbit at all. But they got very far into the flight, and all of the data is going to feed right back into the second launch attempt, which is currently scheduled for no earlier than May of next year. And South Korea looking to kind of build off of this new space race, if you will, or a new space age. In fact, they've literally named SpaceX as an inspiration for we want to develop low-cost rockets to help support the satellite industry. And South Korea has a big industrial base that could support satellite technology. South Korea has operated many satellites that just have been launched on other vehicles. In fact, SpaceX has launched a South Korean military satellite not that long ago, the NASAS mission. There's also been South Korean satellites launched on other launch vehicles. And so they have a very healthy space program, but now they're adding a domestic launch capability for their spacecraft.
Do we know what their long-term plans are for this?
I'm not really sure.
They do have some, I believe they have some upgrades planned for the rocket to increase its payload capability. I haven't heard anything about like incorporating reusability or anything like that. Right now it's a pretty simple expendable vehicle. It's actually fueled by Jet A kerosene and liquid oxygen, which is different from the normal rocket propellant 1 kerosene that like Falcon 9 and Atlas V use. It's just a lower grade of kerosene, but it's a little bit cheaper to acquire. Most kerosene, like if you fed a Merlin engine, the SpaceX Merlin engine, Jet A, it might still work. It would just be way lower performance. Like it's not optimized for that. But using a different grade of kerosene is usually still like fine. In fact, you can design engines, and there are some of the small satellite launch vehicles whose engines are designed to operate on either Jet A or RP1, or like even lower grades of kerosene. It'll change the performance, but the engine is designed to operate any of those 3, which is kind of an interesting thing. This particular vehicle is optimized for Jet A. But either way, there's some upgrades planned, and for now it's kind of aimed just as a satellite launch vehicle for South Korean satellites.
Adrian, I interrupted you. What were you about to say?
I don't even know anymore.
I'm sorry, dude.
No, all good, all good.
Well, I don't see too many questions here at all about the South Korean program, which probably means that we can move on to what chat always wants to ask questions about. Starship has been playing with chopsticks. What's going on there?
Yeah, I can start.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, should we start with the most interesting, like that thing that everyone talks about? Because that would be the fact that we had a static fire, or not even 1 but 2 static fires.
Nobody cares about the static fire. Let's talk about the other stuff.
Oh yeah,
let's talk about launch towers, Adrian. That's way more exciting.
Let's talk about cranes. Let's cranes.
Oh, cranes. Oh yes, we haven't talked about cranes enough in this.
What are those 4 towers for? Are they lightning towers?
Oh my gosh. No. All right, can we talk static fire, please?
Yeah. So at first we had Raptor vacuum engine static fire, which is the first on a vehicle. So that's another like check mark on the milestone list of Starship to orbit. And after noticing that they're not really detanking the vehicle, we had a second static fire just an hour later with the Raptor vacuum engine firing again and the Raptor sea level engine, which is also below the vehicle, firing as well. So we got 2 static fires in one night, which was very exciting to watch.
Yeah, and like you said, this is the first time a Raptor vacuum engine's been fired on a Starship. It's not the first time a Raptor vacuum engine has been fired. The engine was actually designed to be safely fired near sea level, even though it's optimized to be operated in the vacuum of space. And they fired it at the McGregor test facility a bit north of Boca Chica in Texas. But they've now fired it with Starship, and at the time, those were the only 2 engines installed, 1 vacuum and 1 sea level engine. Overnight, since then, in fact, overnight this past evening, they started installing additional engines. Of course, the full complement will be 3 sea level engines and 3 vacuum engines. And so they're working on adding additional engines for additional static fire testing into next week. But Starship 20 finally getting fired up and starting this kind of testing.
It looks like they, with the road closure still in place for, I think, as early as Monday, right?
Yep.
They might hit the pedal again soon and start to fire up more Raptors, which will be exciting because this might be the first time we see more than 3 engines soon to be fired at once. We only saw 3 so far, so we are moving into new ground here, and that's always exciting.
Yes.
We have a whole bunch of different super chats here just right off the bat, and I do want to try to get through them. One of them actually involves Starship, just to circle back to before we get too deep into the SpaceX stuff. Let's see, what was it? DJ Esmerald says, love you guys. Keep doing this. My Saturdays are saved by you. Thank you so very much. We appreciate the tip. Thank you to John Hawkins for becoming a Red Team member. I think I meant Starliner earlier. Ryan Hemstra, $5. Bit behind, but is it possible that a Starship, this is where I met Starliner earlier, but a Starship could make it to L2 to service the James Webb? What's the DV of that versus a trip to Mars?
I mean, with refueling, it probably can.
It's probably physically possible, but I will stress that it is not easy.
Also, with James Webb, I wouldn't want to have a Starship pushing it into another orbit, because even on low thrust, I'm not even sure if that would be a good idea to push the James Webb with that much force. So, yeah, could, but probably won't ever.
Okay.
Listen, the plan is for James Webb to just work, okay, everybody? We don't need to talk about servicing missions. We're not going out to fix it. It's just going to work, and it's going to be great. All right?
James Webb, it just works.
Thomas is my inner voice right now, which I had on replay for about weeks. It's gonna work. No issues. No worries. Yeah.
And Kip thanks us for our answers earlier. Love from Gothenburg, Sweden.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Real quick here. There is a Thomas fan club, but now there is an Adrian fan club as well.
There should
I love
be.
I love the work that Adrian does. Adrian, do you feel that you got any worthy data from the recent static fires? Secondly, do you have any plans to go to Boca Chica?
To the first. Yes, there's many interesting things. How much of a deep dive do you want?
We got plenty of time, Adrian.
Go for it.
Let's go. First off, the tri-vent is gone. Like the usual tri-vent we had is gone because there's TPS on one side, so no vent there. Would be bad. We saw what happens when you went behind some TPS. They fly away. So we have a new vent that is even a bit different in behavior and timing, which also still most likely indicates that they are chilling the Raptor engines below the vehicle, which we can, I think we can see it right here, the one that is basically at the front. Also, what was interesting about this test is that the second static fire just had basically no real warnings. It just was standing there for like an hour, and in a constant state, and then suddenly you had static fire. So missing some indicators here. That was fun. Thanks for that. I was in mid-sentence and had to break up during the stream. Also, Yeah, I think that was the two big ones we had for this test, which was a main tank test, by the way. There is no header tank involved, like in the pre-burner test we had earlier this week, which in some way or form involved the header tank, which was Frosty.
Okay.
Also, I'm planning to go to Boca Chica to answer the second part of the question. I recently just Europeans weren't allowed to enter the US because of COVID, so there wasn't even it wasn't a consideration. But I plan to visit Boca Chica in 2022. Yes.
I believe all of NSF's European counterparts are planning to invade the US in the not too distant future, so
Yeah, there's some planning going on with when we storm.
DJ Esmerald says, I'm concerned about the amount of fire after the RVAC shut down. Why was that?
That's pretty normal. Most rocket engines do that to some degree. It's just residual gases and propellants that come out during shutdown getting burned off. That's not necessarily indicative of a problem. Not that it can't be a problem. In the past, we've seen, Raptor engines eat themselves and, melted parts flying off and things like that. But
Engine-rich combustion.
yeah, engine-rich combustion, if you will. But for the most part, that's pretty normal. So I wouldn't, we're too worried about it. The big takeaway is if you go back and see them removing engines and replacing them, that might be a sign that something might have actually gone wrong. Also, they could do that for not different reasons, so it's not necessarily true even then. But I don't believe when they've started to install the new engines, I don't believe we saw them take out either of the two that were fired previously. So I don't think we have any indications that the fires were anything other than nominal.
Also, these engines are built for pretty heavy firings.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as the fire is not sustained, it shouldn't probably do any damage.
On damage, Ed B asks, how is the tile projection system? How many did they lose? And then Musical Wolves with $5 says S20 is not losing heat tiles. It has a hydraulic confetti cannon located randomly around S20 to celebrate a successful test.
I think there's still people counting, and there's some numbers floating around how many tiles were lost. But I think so far
Thank you, Michael, for the Michael art.
So far, the count is around 20 to 30-ish tiles that were lost in the whole static fire campaign, which is it's hard to put into context, I think, because even one tile lost at a bad position probably means a loss of vehicle during re-entry. So that's still something that needs to be fixed. But on the other hand, people expected a lot worse before this static fire. And so I think that's about, yeah, I think it's a okay to good result that only a few tails flew off.
Elon did confirm after the test, I believe his actual quote was shaking out the problems, literally. But they did expect for some tiles to come off. They're still finalizing that heat shield, design and the way they're attaching the tiles and things like that. And this is a problem that was also very prevalent early on in the space shuttle program. Those heat shield tiles were also not easy to get to stay on, and there was a lot of work that went into that. So obviously it's not, I don't think anyone is concerned too much that this will be a major issue in the long term. It's something that they're definitely still working on, and hopefully they'll be able to resolve relatively quickly. And these static fire tests are part of this heat shield design kind of validation and things like that. So.
Also, what maybe is important here is that for the first orbital test flight, they do not plan to land for the orbital test flight, the first one.
Right.
So they will probably gain a lot of important data during that first flight, how the TPS behaves, and how they can improve it in future flights. So it's not critical hardware to have perfectly finished before the first flight. It's more what you find out on the flight.
Oh, the super chats are just sort of flowing in right now, and a big thank you to all of you who are doing them. We're going to try to get to them all in time before we end today, because we do have a bit more time. $5 from Shiny Bad Guy. Please say something about the skies during the static fire. Yes. How does the flow sheet look like?
Oh, the spreadsheet.
The skies look beautiful, I think, by the way. We had the first static fire was like in the last hour of any light, and it was nice timing. And the second one was with the moon on top of the launch site. It was a great shot, and I think there was some, like, Mary made a great shot with the first static fire, which is just an amazing picture. If you haven't, you should check it out on Twitter. It's one of my favorite pictures of a static fire so far. How the flow sheets looks now, I haven't put the full data into the spreadsheet yet.
Adrian is the master behind the spreadsheet, which tells us when starships are going to do things. So, yeah, and which, by the way, shop.NASASpaceflight.com, you can get a spread shirt. And oh, he's wearing it. I didn't even notice. Adrian's got the spread shirt on right now. So there you go.
I love that.
There you go. Also, we have a calendar. I put mine away already.
Which
Mine
is
got
also
today.
here.
Oh yeah, Adrian's got one behind. Adrian's doing all the store plugging today. But there's the spreadshirt. I don't know, maybe Adrian, when the spreadsheet gets updated, do we need to update the spreadshirt design?
I can talk with Mark about that. I think we should.
There you go.
The calendar is fantastic, by the way. You have all the different NASA spaceflight people posing next to Boca Chica. You've got Das out there, and he's posing with his antenna. Definitely want that calendar. None of those things are in it, but still.
No, it's a Starship calendar. It's a bunch of photos from Mary, Jack, Nick, Stephen Marr, some renders from Mech, a bunch of Starship content in this calendar. It's very, very cool. Highly recommend.
When DOS calendar. We have a tip here from, well, it's 2 tips in 1 from Tarek. $5. First of all, thank you so much for that. And Adrian, before each static fire, the waterworks under the pad started. You might be able to use that as an indicator.
I thought so as well, but it's off in timing. The first one started 30 seconds before T0. The second one started 20 seconds before T0. So it's a good thing to be sure that you don't talk over the static fire. Mm-hmm. It's a commentator indicator.
But it doesn't predict the TO. It doesn't predict the T0.
Yeah, it's a good commentator indicator.
Commentator indicator. Say that 5 times fast.
No.
Nope. Not gonna do it. Phil Canny, to get away from the super test just a second. Do you think new lunar Starship will employ aluminum and a third stage to allow main tanks and engines to stay in orbit, given the upper section at the Starbase is being scrapped?
Oh, okay. So I would not read into the mock-up in Boca Chica being scrapped in any way. That nose cone has been there for years. What we're talking about is there was a nose cone that they painted white. They flipped the NASA logo on it. There was an American flag on it. And with all of that considered, it was being used to help mock up some of the lunar lander elements within it. However, that's been sitting out there for years. The fact that they're scrapping it is not an indication of anything, really. It's probably just old and not being used anymore, while they do development work elsewhere. There's no third stage going to be used for keeping tanks and engines in orbit or anything. I don't think anything like that is in the work.
G-Dub with $5. Thank you again. I'm thinking BN3 was cut down to Starship size so SpaceX can practice with its chopsticks, picking up at lower levels. And thank you for all the video updates.
So, while I think that why I think that is not the case is here because they cut up the top, if I recall correctly, and basically you remove the part where you would normally lift it. So if I think if they wanted to test the chopsticks with it, they would probably not cut the part where you would lift normally a piece of hardware. So that's why I'm not thinking they will use it for a lift test. But maybe I'm totally wrong, and you can quote this in the future and then say how wrong I am.
Well, we should be talking about these chopsticks are the other big thing that happened this week. Kind of got overshadowed by static fire testing, but some more construction progress at the orbital launch site. What we're referring to are these arms that will be used for boosters and to land on them, basically. Mounting points on the side of the booster will come down and land on these arms so that the booster doesn't need to have landing legs on it. At least that's the general idea. And they've installed those arms onto the launch tower now as they continue building up the launch site itself. So that is what we're referring to.
Yeah, finally some crane talk here. And also the crane is detached at this point, so the chopsticks are no longer in like hold by crane in any shape or form. They are installed. They are on the tower. So yeah, exciting hardware that was watched for a long time now and finally in the place where it should be.
Let's see here. We're about to go into a tile question lightning round.
All right.
Yeah, we've got so many. Is it better for tile to fly off in the middle or at the end of the ship, along with $5 from Musical Wolves? Thank you so much.
I think leading edge tiles are probably more critical than over the body. Generally, I mean, maybe marginally, but for the most part, I mean, it's not that it would be able to like not survive reentry if one tile fell off. But the tiles need to be more resilient than they have been so far. I mean, if vibration from static fire is enough for some to fall off, I mean, think about the loads during an actual launch and during a reentry. So there's work to be done, but I mean, where you're going to get to the point where you're expecting 0 tiles to fall off, and that's how you ensure that the heat shield is safe. It's not really better for it to fall off from one place or the other, I don't think.
Logan asks, how many tiles are on the ship? Love the stream.
At least 3.
More even, I think 5.
I
count
believe
past 10.
attempts to count the number of tiles have been pretty futile. I think that's been something that's been given up on. There's way too many.
I run out after 10. Unorthodox. Is S21 using a different TPS configuration? It looks different.
I'm not sure if we can get. We gotta get a picture of that. Let me see if I can get one for you.
Yeah, I saw the pictures, and just to fill the time now while Thomas searched for that picture, I think it looks a bit different. So with ship 20, you can still see some color differences, which kind of looks like the tiles are a little bit different angled. And so far, I do not see that with ship 21, but that could also be the case because these tiles and these already have like stacking and now some tests behind them, so there could be a difference because of that, which I am perfect. Thank you. I was running out of any information I could have.
Yeah, I just found another picture too that we can also bring up, but that's the nose cone part. Yep.
€5 from Mark Garretts, who needs an updated sheet when spreadshirt.
Hello, Mark. I will get it to you.
Oh wait, that's our Mark. Oh jeez.
Yeah, that's our Mark.
And then we have 4.5 pounds from Tim, who asks, do you think the TPS tile loss is worsened by the ship being clamped to the launch stand? Love your work.
Maybe that could induce some changes. For the most part, I don't think it's a huge deal. I think the bigger thing is just the tiles need to be stronger and withstand those vibrations, whether it's clamped to it or not, because the vibrations will continue during launch and will be worse than they were during a 1 and 2 engine static fire when there's 6 engines, and when it's sitting on top of a super heavy with 29 engines or 33 engines. So there's work to be done there.
Steve Bowen, Canadian $5. Where did it go? I just lost it. We were going to get the status of the lawsuit, and the answer there is it did not go very well for me. The Frank Herbert estate did get their cease and desist letter, and I can't dress up like a sandworm outside their property anymore. So.
I'm pretty sure there's a different lawsuit referred here.
Oh, okay.
But thanks for the update, Matt. I think it was just confirmed that there was a hearing about that lawsuit, which is still ongoing. Mm-hmm. But besides the fact that there was this hearing, I do not think there was any update on the lawsuit, which makes sense because if they're right now in the phase where they're hearing something, they're not having a decision right now. So, yeah. And also that hearing was closed.
Yes.
$7 from Dougal, who says, thanks, y'all.
Appreciate it, Dougal.
And then I think it's about time again, isn't it?
I mean, we did
Um,
start like 5 minutes late. I don't know if you guys are good. We have
did.
time for a couple more questions. I think.
Okay. From Peter Robertson. Hello from London. When do you think the next big launch by SpaceX will happen?
Next big launch?
In 8 days. I would say
Oh
I
yeah.
would classify that.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So a crewed mission definitely counts as a big launch, regardless of what the criteria is, and that's coming up in 8 days. A week from tomorrow, SpaceX is launching the Crew 3 mission to the International Space Station. So that's coming up from here at the Kennedy Space Center.
And also cool for me as a German, there
Oh
is a
yes, of
German flying
course.
on that mission. That is
First,
Matthias Maurer, which will fly.
first German astronaut to fly on Crew Dragon.
Yes.
Fox asks, kind of dumb question. No, it's not. But could a full hull TPS tile be built, like only one for the entire ship, like one
so instead of a
giant
tiled heat
tile?
shield, just
Yeah.
that material in the shape of a starship. That would be difficult. I mean, you can like heat shield tiles don't have to be flat. You can see the tiles on like the leading edges of the fins and stuff are curved. That's a thing that can happen. I think if you tried to make one that big, the odds of it not being cracked anywhere is pretty much zero. I don't know how you would transport it. I don't know how you would install it. I don't know how any of this would be practical.
One of the main
I'm not
reasons for it being a tile, right, is that
right,
so if it gets
exactly.
damaged, you can replace it.
Exactly. So that's the reasoning behind that.
Okay. Do you think the flaps can handle the load of a starship while stacking with the chopsticks? Well, it's got to be engineered to, right? This is from
Right.
Maddie.
Yeah, that is part of the point. So yes, I think they are because they would have designed it to do so.
Terry Cook asks, "Is S20 still a test ship?"
A
Yes.
defined yeah, like it's not an. I wouldn't call it an operational ship because it can't do any payload. So it's a test ship. Yes, it's a test orbital flight. Hopefully.
Also, I want to circle back to the previous question. Thank you, Michael, for fact checking me on this. The loading points that will be used for stacking are not the flaps themselves. There are loading points right beneath them. So when I say so, not necessarily. Okay, so the design is for those loading points to be used to carry the mass of the weight of Starship. So my correction there. My apologies.
We've had a few questions about this topic. This one's going to be from Michael Tirada. You won the lottery here. Why not Pika X for the tiles?
This is all about reusability. So Pika X, which is the heat shield tile material used on Dragon capsules, is not reusable. Dragon capsules have reused parts of their heat shields. However, it's a more limited number of flights before the heat shield has to be replaced. These new tiles that are being used on Starship are a different design and are much more reusable. They're intended to fly many, many times without needing to be replaced. And thus, that's the difference. It's about improving the reusability of the heat shield.
Windows asks, is there going to be any test payload on S20?
No, most likely no.
Right.
Because the nose cone is already attached, and there's no like opening or any sort of payload area right now. So most likely it will fly empty.
Ship 20 was tiled in haste for the full stack photo op, hence a lot of repair needed. Comment from Tony. Could Atlas use Raptor engines if Blue Origin's BN4 keep getting delayed? Would SpaceX sell them? From Kip.
So talking about the Vulcan rocket, rather than Atlas, but Vulcan, which is using the BE4 from Blue Origin. That's another methane and liquid oxygen fueled engine. I think from an engineering perspective, it might be doable. You'd still have to redesign all of the plumbing. You'd have to redesign the entire engine section. I'd have to check some thrust figures to figure out how many engines you would actually need. Not that should be prohibited. That should be prohibitive. You might even the two engines might burn at slightly different mixture ratios, in which case the tankage has to be changed completely. Like the liquid oxygen and fuel tanks have to be resized. So it's not as simple as just dropping in new engines. And that's all the engineering. That's from the engineering side. From the business side, I don't think SpaceX has any interest in selling engines to their competitor. So, no, I do not believe that is something that's a possibility.
So the reworded answer is basically, could you design a vehicle that looks like a Vulcan right now and uses Raptor engine, but it's basically a completely different vehicle?
Yeah.
Sa asks, any news on New Glenn?
Not any super recent news. New Glenn is still slated to fly no earlier than the end of 2022, and it's going to be depending on how those B4 engine development finishes up and any work they can do with the Pathfinder that they've got at Kennedy Space Center, getting that out to the pad, doing some fit checks there and stuff like that. The engines are the big ticket item, though.
All right, and to close us out here for questions, Octavian asks, with Fo 20, B4 S20 launch in December. Any bets?
Nope.
Nope.
Next year. That's the bet.
Not a gambling crew. Yep.
I probably can do a sentence or two on launch date. So even if you ignore all the regulatory parts, like put that by side and pretend that the FAA is ready to support the Starship launch today. Even in this case, you still have a Starship that has not all engine tests fired yet. You have a booster that had no testing at all yet. You have
heat shield tiles that are falling off.
Yeah, you have an orbital tank farm, which is not completely done yet. I mean, yeah, every tank is there, but that doesn't mean that the tank farm is ready to support any launch. You have an orbital launch pad that still is not, like, done at all. So, no, sorry, they won't go to orbit in, like, 9-ish weeks. They will probably try or hope to do it in Q1 of 2022. But I doubt at this point that they will fly, or I think it's impossible that they will fly this year.
Thomas or Adrian, any closing thoughts here about any of the topics this week?
I'll just reiterate what Adrian just said. Starship is probably next year, but I will say that it is very exciting that we are back into proper Starship testing. I'll be honest, we've done enough crane lift streams. It's time to get back to tank watching and watching some engines firing. So static fires are very exciting. That is a very big milestone as we do get closer to orbital flight tests. And I'm excited about that first and foremost. And hopefully we'll get some more testing for that next week as well.
With better times for Europeans, thank you.
Well, if you find yourself concerned that we've come to the end of another NASA Spaceflight Live, just remember that fear is the mind killer, and we will be back. I would like to thank our guests for being here today. Thomas Burghardt is the news director for NASA Spaceflight. Thomas, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at TGMetsFan98, and just appreciate being back on the show and hang out with you guys and chat. Thank you so much for tuning in.
And Adrian Beil, is the intrepid reporter for NASA's spaceflight. Where can people find you?
Also on Twitter on @BCCarCounters. And yeah, thanks for having me.
And I have been your host. I am Matt Anderson. You can find me on Twitch and Twitter at BadNewsBaron. I would like to thank you all for joining us here today. It's been a pleasure being able to present with you, and thank you, chat, for all of your questions as well and helping the show progress, as well as all the super chats and memberships that we have. Big thank you to all of our members who help make this show possible and the larger mission of NASA Spaceflight. Thank you, guys. I think with that, we can go over to the live channel. Yeah, we've got a 24-hour live stream that is always looking over Boca Chica, and I think we're going to meet you all over there.
All right, thanks for watching, everybody.
Bye, all.
Propulsion continues to be normal.
RCP chamber pressure looks good. Following up. Roger, roll, Atlantic.
Water towers, fly! Yes!
Tango Delta nominal.
Flight down, speed off. Bring in, SC off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.